Are you part of the great resignation, that mass exodus of people who are leaving their jobs to start something new? Then something you need to consider is what to do with your company 401k. Rather than just rolling it over, consider opening a truly self-directed IRA. With a self-directed IRA, a truly self-directed IRA, your retirement portfolio can include real estate, precious metals, cryptocurrency, notes, loans, a new business, and traditional equities like stocks and bonds. You can make any investment the law allows with a truly self-directed retirement account. Listen, you probably have questions, so why not take the time to get the answers? Start with going to IRAadvantage.com. Then talk to the truly self-directed IRA professionals at IRA Advantage.
Would you like to learn more about truly self-directed IRAs? Then visit IRAadvantage.com, view our videos, and call IRA Advantage. Let us set up a truly self-directed IRA for you. That's IRAadvantage.com.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Well, on a day in Miami in which for the very first time in American history, a former president has been indicted and arraigned in front of a federal court in Miami, Florida, it's a great distraction from the much bigger story about the 17 audio recordings that apparently expose the Joe Biden bribery scandal in which $5 million is alleged to have been paid to then Vice President Joe Biden. I'll give you the details that we know about from the post-millennial and other sources, but let me do that in just a moment. First, welcome to Tuesday. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And, of course, you can always vote in our Twitter poll. And this has to do with the story I'm going to give the details on in a moment. Former President Donald Trump pleaded not guilty today, just a few hours ago, in Miami, Florida, to charges relating to retaining classified information. And as I told you, Joe Biden has been implicated. The letter that the U.S. Congress finally got its hands on last week that indicates the FBI has known for some time that one of its best sources has told the FBI, told them a long time ago, that Joe Biden, when he was vice president all those years ago, got a $5 million bribe. And where did it come from? Ukraine. Doesn't this get better and better in some ways, worse and worse in other ways? Ukraine, where we're sending hundreds of billions of dollars today. Ukraine, where Joe Biden's terrible son, Hunter Biden, the coked up guy who got kicked out of the Navy Reserve, the guy who bought a gun illegally and was never prosecuted for it, while a lot of other Americans get prosecuted for that very same thing. Yes, that Hunter Biden and that Joe Biden got $5 million in a bribe, according to that source. So I'm going to ask you in the Twitter poll today, which concerns you more? Donald Trump's classified documents and whatever he might have done or didn't do with them that may or may not have been a crime. I don't think he broke the law. Does Donald Trump's classified documents concern you more, or the $5 million bribe allegation to Joe Biden from Ukraine? Now, I would have to go with the $5 million to Joe. I mean, the classified documents seem important, but again, I don't think Donald Trump acted illegally, and I don't think Donald Trump put Americans' national security in danger with his handling of classified documents. $5 million from Ukraine, and now we're sending hundreds of billions of dollars there, and his son made millions of dollars sitting on a board of directors that he had no capacity for adding anything to, and all those other illicit deals that Joe's son did in Moscow and Beijing, and you're concerned about whether or not Donald Trump had classified documents. Because, as we all know, Joe Biden himself has confessed that he had classified documents that he began taking from the government's custody back when he was a U.S. Senator, and he had no authority whatsoever to have the documents, to retain the documents. He had no authority at all. He certainly couldn't declassify them, not back when he was a U.S. Senator. He admits that all the way back 49 years ago that Joe Biden began taking classified documents home with him. And he kept a lot of them for the better part of half a century. And you're worried about whether or not Donald Trump would have done things that put American national security at risk? Yeah, that's the big concern we've got. In any case, I'd vote for the Joe Biden $5 million bribe. You can find the Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. It's always brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC, of course, has the conservative values I believe in, so I joined the group a long time ago. You can too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Before I get to the details on those audio recordings that were held as a kind of insurance policy, you know what I'm talking about. Let me tell you what's coming up the rest of this hour. Should Americans be forced to subsidize multi-billion-dollar steel companies at the grocery checkout line? If the government goes after a mother for failing to disclose her drug use on a gun background check, that's the Form 4473, should the president's son also be prosecuted for the same thing? And by the way, you know about Joe Biden hosting that Pride party, the one for LGBTQ on the White House lawn over the weekend, where one transgender, a man with artificial breasts, decided to go topless. Is that what Joe Biden meant when he said he'd bring back honor and decency to the White House? And take just a moment to cast a vote in my Twitter poll. Find it at Lars Larson Show on Twitter and at larslarson.com. Let me cite the reporting, great reporting by the Post-Millennial. Speaking on the Senate floor yesterday, Senator Chuck Grassley, great Republican from Iowa, says that a Burisma executive, now let me stop right there. What is Burisma again? I know there's going to be a test at the end of the show. Burisma is the natural gas company in Ukraine that is owned by a Ukrainian billionaire, because we always hear about Russian oligarchs, but we also have oligarchs in places like Ukraine. And one of them owns Burisma, the natural gas company, the one that was about to come under investigation by a prosecutor in Ukraine until Vice President Joe Biden famously said, if you don't fire that prosecutor, I'm going to hold up a $1 billion loan guarantee from the United States of America. Joe bragged about it on camera, and we've run the audio for you. So what happened? This Burisma executive cited in an FBI form, it's called the 1023, alleged a bribery scheme with then Vice President Joe Biden. And you know what he held on to as a kind of insurance policy? 17 audio recordings of his conversations about that bribe. Grassley says the FD 1023 form retained by the FBI has a redacted reference stating that the Burisma executive possesses 15 audio recordings of phone calls that took place between himself and Hunter Biden. Let me remind you at that point, Hunter Biden, the son of Joe Biden, had all these business dealings in Ukraine. And Joe Biden always said, I never talked to my son about business. Well, a claim that I find absolutely impossible to believe, but he says that's the truth. The document also states the Burisma executive possesses 2 audio recordings of phone calls, get this, between himself and then Vice President Joe Biden. Remember that Joe said, I never talked to any of Hunter's business associates? I mean, even the Obama White House knew and were concerned about the fact that Hunter Biden was doing business overseas that they thought might compromise America's, diplomacy and maybe even security. And they brought that up with Joe, and Joe said, I don't have anything to do with Hunter's business partners. The recordings were allegedly kept as a kind of insurance policy for the foreign national just in case he got into a tight spot. Well, the 1023 form also indicates that then Vice President Joe Biden may have been involved in Burisma deciding to hire Hunter Biden. And boy, did that pay off for Hunter. I mean, they were paying him close to $1 million a year to sit on a board of directors. He knew nothing about natural gas. He wasn't a very good lawyer. And, of course, he'd been kicked out of the Naval Reserve for cocaine. I mean, he wasn't your ideal board member, but he was getting $1 million a year. And maybe it was the big guy who arranged that spot for him. Coming up, we'll talk about the State Department and the coronavirus. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Well, I guess a day late and a dollar short. The U.S. State Department has finally concluded that the coronavirus, which is attributed 7 million deaths on planet Earth, was created in a Chinese lab should China finally be held accountable for that? Frank Gaffney is our friend who's the founder of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., author of the #1 best-selling book on Amazon in its category called The Indictment, Prosecuting the Chinese Communist Party and Friends for Crimes Against America, China, and the World. Frank, welcome back.
It's good to be with you, Lars, as always.
Is this going to be enough that the Times of London says the U.S. State Department has finally said, yep, you're right, it came out of the biological warfare lab in Wuhan. We know where it was created?
Oh, it's not going to be enough for some people, but it's more than enough for me, that's for sure. What it speaks to, Lars, is something that we've known really from very early on in this so-called pandemic. I say so-called because what we were aware of almost immediately was that the Chinese Communist Party was deliberately sending it around the world, including, of course, to the United States, which means that it was a biological weapons attack. And the more evidence that has been accumulated, including that has now moved the State Department finally to join the Department of Energy and the FBI, which very belatedly came to similar conclusions. It just is further icing on the cake. The real problem was that evidence, available as it was, again, from very early on, that the virus came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, not a wet market, as they call them, somewhere else in the city, and that it had been designed, genetically engineered, given what is called gain of function capabilities, that is to say, make it more easily transmissible and lethal among humans. But that didn't fit the narrative. The narrative was that this was all not a problem. This was not something to worry about. That this was something, in fact, that just came out of nature. And at first we were told by the Chinese Communist Party, and by the way, the World Health Organization as well, which is controlled by them, that it really couldn't be transmitted among humans, and that the right way to deal with it was to lock everybody down. And none of that was true.
And by the way, Frank, I keep reminding people, January 14th of 2020, the WHO tweeted out, still got a copy of it, it'll probably get scrubbed at some point off Twitter, but it was the WHO on January 14th, that late in the game, at the beginning of the pandemic, saying there is no sign that COVID-19, as they called it then, is transmissible from human to human, that it's spread by some other means, which would have been significant if it was something like, say, AIDS, that is usually transmitted by either sexual contact or needles or exchange of blood. That would have been a whole different matter, wouldn't it? But they said, and this is the WHO, and I think they were lying at the time they said it, and they knew they were lying. I want to share something with you that I just saw pop up in front of me. Are you familiar with a journalist by the name of Matt Taibbi?
I am.
Okay. And Michael Schellenberger. And Taibbi just pushed this out, just literally, I saw it about a half an hour ago. And the headline on it is, Michael Schellenberger's Public today released a story, quote, first person sickened by COVID-19 was the Chinese scientist who oversaw gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab. And they're citing 3 government officials in naming a scientist by the name of Ben Hu, H-U, who is in charge of the gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute, was patient 0. Now, Frank, for the Chinese government to say, we didn't know what was happening, we didn't know where it came from, it probably came from the wet market down the street. If their top scientist, who was overseeing the gain-of-function process at this lab, gets sick, I mean, for him as a scientist, his first conclusion would be, if I caught something, I probably caught it at work and not at a wet market, right? I mean, you wouldn't go home and say, well, I work all day around viruses, but I probably got this at, when I went to the convenience store.
Well, especially if there's no reason to believe he went to the wet market.
Right.
Look, this is a pack of lies. Let's be clear, Lars. And unfortunately, it wasn't just the Chinese who were lying. It wasn't just the World Health Organization, which was lying on behalf of the Chinese and under their direction. It was also Tony Fauci who was lying. He knew full well that this work was going on at that laboratory, gain-of-function research using, scientists and their technology that he paid for. And the fact that he has thus far gone unaccountable for having lied, and lied in ways that have translated, let's be clear, to the mishandling of the, what is it now, 1,100,000 persons in our country who've been murdered by this virus or by the inept handling of it. I mean, there has to be a reckoning. And, as we've talked about, Lars, we've written a book called The Indictment. One of the charges in the indictment is the Chinese Communist Party used biological warfare against us. And we need to hold them accountable, yes, of course, but also their friends. And I put Tony Fauci and, the CDC and the FDA and the Surgeon General and a whole cast of others who went along with this, who enabled it, and in some cases at least did so every bit as culpable as Ben Ho, or who of the Chinese laboratory, and those who obscured his demise or his disease. This is, in short, a problem that is emblematic of what has been done to us, yes, by the Chinese Communist Party, of course, but also by the captured elites throughout our country that have enabled them to do this kind of thing.
Well, and there's one little quote from this story I want to share with you. This guy's name is Jamie Metzel, who's a former member of the WHO Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. And he's quoted in this story by Schellenberger, says, had U.S. officials, including Dr. Fauci, stated from day one that COVID-19 research-related origin was a very real possibility and made it clear that we had very little idea what viruses were being held at the Wuhan lab, what work was being done there, and who was doing that work, our national and global conversations would have been dramatically different. It would have taken us an entire, and I think Fauci knew, just as you say, I think he knew that he has become, and he was made a much bigger multimillionaire by the pandemic. He went into the pandemic worth an estimated $5 million, according to OpenTheBooks.com that does public records research. He came out so he'd spent decades working for the government, getting to $5 million. The next 3 years added $7 million to his personal wealth, along with whatever deals he's cutting now that he's no longer technically with the NIH. So he had a multi-million-dollar reason to cover up or anything that would implicate him in the research that created this thing, right?
It's blood money. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And unfortunately, again, what flowed from it, Lars, was we were told we had to adopt the Chinese model, as it was described, and that was the masks, and that was the social distancing, and that was the quarantines, and that was the lockdowns, and that was the jabs with inadequately tested vaccines, and that was the vaccine passports that restricted our travel and so on, all of which were instituted in this country. Again, not to keep us from getting sick or dying, it turns out. In fact, in a number of cases, by denying proper treatment with things like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. We killed a lot of people unnecessarily.
Absolutely. And there was no other way for them to make the vaccines mandatory. I've never taken it, but by saying we have to give it emergency use authorization because there is no other thing available. That's Frank Gaffney from the Center for Security Policy, and you've got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I'll get back to your phone calls here in just a minute, just this segment, though. I want to mention this because earlier I mentioned that Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa, member of the U.S. Senate, says that the FBI is trying to hide 17 audio recordings that it knows about, 15 of them between Hunter Biden and an executive at Burisma, where they're talking about various parts of Hunter Biden's deal. Now, you understand that what Burisma was doing very clearly, They weren't paying Hunter Biden $1 million a year to sit on the board of directors because of his charming personality or because of his deep knowledge of, strippers and cocaine. They were paying him because dear old dad was Vice President Joe. But what the FBI has also said to know is that there are 2 audio recordings between the Burisma executive and then Vice President Joe Biden. And the allegation is, from this source that the FBI trusts, is that Joe Biden, when he was vice president, got a $5 million bribe from Burisma, even though he had denied he was ever involved in his son Hunter's business dealings. Well, consider this. Are ABC, CBS, and NBC censoring those Biden bombshells? On Thursday, June 8th, so not quite a week ago, 2 massive political stories broke. Only one of them got covered by the broadcast networks. Over 4 different days, the big 3, ABC, CBS, and NBC, practically crammed their evening, morning, and Sunday roundtable shows with a total, according to Newsbusters, of 291 minutes of coverage dedicated to the Donald Trump indictment. And how much did the Joe Biden Burisma alleged bribery of $5 million get? 0 seconds. 0. Now consider what's going on and consider that the fix is in. 866-439-5277. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, if you're a naysayer, 866-439-5277. Let's go to Ken in Nevada. Hey, Ken, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
Is this me? My name's actually Tim.
Tim. Okay, Tim. We'll flog the producers later. What's on your mind, Tim?
Not a problem. Good afternoon. That was a great interview, and it made me think of a question I'd really like your opinion on. I respect.
I'll do my best.
You never hear what the Chinese did in the aftermath of COVID about creating their own vaccines, how they went about it, how effective they were. I have that question, and I got one more question I'd like to ask you about immigration, and then I'll listen off the air.
Well, let me tell you, Tim, first of all, on the vaccines, the Chinese say they have a vaccine. I don't know how they made it. I don't know much about the background of it. I suspect it was not made the way the mRNA was, unless they just ripped off the technology, which they tend to do a lot. They rip off technology from the Western world all the time. It's how they do business. But that's the best. And whether or not it's effective, China has continued to have outbreaks. They have continued to lock down entire cities, which, by the way, if you look at it from a distance, doesn't seem to be a game changer for China any more than it was a game changer in America. And I thought the best comparison of lockdown versus not lockdown was California and Florida. California and Florida, both southern states. California and Florida, both fairly large populations. Florida, a bit older on average than California. And yet Florida and California, at the end of the day, had about the same results. So California could have kept its entire economy chugging along the way Florida did and not done the massive shutdowns, including Gavin Newsom, the governor, telling people you can't go out to dinner. They literally at one point told people you can't walk out of your house and take a walk by yourself. So that's about as comprehensive an answer as I can give you right now.
Interesting. Yeah, you don't hear much about it. That could be because of the state-controlled media in China. My question on immigration, you hear about DeSantis and Governor Abbott, and they're shipping all these people north. Geographically, how are all these people getting to Florida? They're not exactly on our southern border.
They're not, but it's not that far. I think, and Tim, we're not getting the full story on this, but you understand that when all these people show up in Texas and other border states, they're either on their own transportation, having people they know pick them up, or in many cases, Joe Biden has been taking your money and my money, and he's been providing chartered flights that have taken these people to various parts of the United States. I don't know if you remember it, but there was a point where we found out that that in the middle of the night, there's a county in upstate New York. It's, 50 miles, 60 miles. I've been to Westchester County once or twice, but not for any length of time. But it's a county north of New York City. and it's not all of it. It's actually kind of a nice place. But they had flights coming into their airports late at night. And you'd wonder, well, why would they fly airplanes full of illegal aliens into an obscure place like Westchester Airport? And the answer was because it was out of sight. If you flew into LaGuardia, if you flew into Newark, which is in New Jersey, or even into the private airport at Teterboro, you're right there near the New York metropolitan area, and it would be noticed by a lot of people. Fly them into Westchester County at 2 in the morning, you don't see them much at all. So Biden was using our money. He was also putting a lot of these people on commercial airlines. And Tim, early on we found out, and I was outraged by it, when you or I go to the airport to get on an airplane, the first thing they ask you at TSA, where's your ticket? Where's your picture ID? And if you say, well, how many of these illegals have picture ID? Almost none of them, especially the ones that say they're coming from Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador, but they're actually coming from Cuba or some other place. What they do is they throw their ID and sometimes even the currency in their pocket away. And I've talked to any number of people who go down on the border. They're conservatives who are concerned about this problem, and they find stacks of this stuff just thrown away in the desert. And I saw a lot of it because, and why? Why would you throw away your Cuban driver's license if you want to come into America? Because you're going to tell the people at the border when you're picked up, well, I'm from Honduras or I'm from Guatemala, because those are the magic words to get in. And if you tell them instead, I'm from Cuba or I'm from somewhere in the Middle East, you're probably not going to get in. So how are they getting in? They get in that way. But then we found out, we asked, well, what does TSA ask for from these people that the Biden administration was putting on commercial airline flights with people like you and me? And I've talked to people who I know who sat right next to somebody. And they would, chat them up and say, hey, where are you coming from? Well, I'm from Guatemala. Did you cross the border? Yes, I did. Are you one of the people coming into the country, across our border? And they'd say, yeah. And they gave me this manila envelope full of other documents. And they wrote them a ticket saying, show up in court a couple of years from now. And the TSA accepted that as the kind of proof they needed to prove that the person was, who they said they were. Whatever they told the border agent, that's the standard we're at right now. By the way, thanks very much. I appreciate the call. Hey, I got to tell you something. If you're buying that name brand CBD right now, write down this website, genericCBD.com. That's genericCBD.com. And make the switch to generic CBD and save up to 75%. Their products are fantastic. They sell a muscle and joint cream that's out of this world. My wife and I love generic CBD. It retails for about $100, on sale right now for $39.95. But you can try it for free. Just pay the shipping, $2.95. This penetrating cream melts into your muscles and joints, your knees, your elbows, and your lower back, and it goes to work fast. Plus, it doubles as a great moisturizer. You'll love it. And don't worry, it's not a subscription. Get your free sample at genericCBD.com. Get that sample headed your way right now. See what this amazing CBD cream can do for you. Get your free sample at genericCBD.com. That's genericCBD.com. These products and statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease or illness. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I think that all of us have experienced the absolutely devastating kind of inflation that we have seen in America right now. We know what's causing it: massive spending by the United States government. Well, it seems to be easing just a bit after it hit some of the highest rates last year. But saying that we're better than last year at 4% seems like kind of weak tea compared to getting back to the 2% that America enjoyed for so very long. So I thought we'd get Gerard Simica on, who's chair of the free market group called Consumer Action for a Strong Economy. Mr. Simica, welcome to the program.
Hey, good afternoon, Lars. Great to be with you.
I want to ask you about something, about a federal steel can tax. What the heck is that?
Well, it's an issue that is really flying under the radar right now. Nobody's really talking about it, and that's something that we hope to change. But as you mentioned, we're now starting to feel a little bit of the loosening of inflation's iron grip. There is a company, a $10 billion steel giant out in Cleveland called Cleveland Cliffs, who is petitioning the U.S. government, the Biden administration, and the Commerce Department for an increase of up to 300% tariffs of imported tin plate steel, which is what we use for hundreds of everyday items that people buy, but especially things like food, pet food, aerosols, oil cans. So this is something that would be really devastating to Americans who are, trying to put food on the table and just trying to pay their bills right now.
Yeah, because when I first saw that we are going to talk to you, I thought, is tin plate the stuff they make washers and dryers and dishwashers and things or like that out? No, this is the stuff, so in effect, almost everything that comes in a metal can from the store is made out of tin plate. Is it fair to say that?
A large segment of and there's different kinds of tin plates, so it can vary. But this tin plate that we're talking about we use tons of it every month, and American domestic steel makers don't even make enough to meet demand. A lot of the steel volume that our steel industry who have invested in upgrading their equipment and new technologies, they're supplying other kinds of steel, like for the auto industry or for the energy industry or for, fine-tune electronics and satellites and things like that. This is a small portion of the overall steel industry, but from the consumer standpoint, it is exactly what puts, food on the table. It puts corn in the can, and whether it's, again, hundreds of items people buy every day, if these tariffs were to go through, you'd see prices increase on each item of can anywhere from 20 to 56 cents. And it's something people are going to notice when they're at the store.
Yeah, I take it this is being done as a protectionist move, saying if you don't give us a 300% tariff on imported tin plate, then the domestic manufacturers are going to have a hard time existing, and it'll all end up being imported. Is that the general logic behind those who want the tariff?
Well, it is one company. There's two main companies that actually manufacture tin plate steel. One is U.S. Steel, and they are not part of this petition. Cleveland-Cliffs and they and their union are the sole movers of this effort. And it would raise their profits handsomely because it would price out steel from many of our competitors. It would also cause supply chain shortages because the people who use can manufacturers and others who manufacture goods from tin plate are going to be scrambling to find supply. America can only make about 50% of the tin plate that we actually need for our economy. So where are we going to get the other 50%? Either we're going to go without or we're going to be paying a lot more for it. And that's where the other countries that are importing aren't going to pay for it. It's going to be the consumers who ultimately will pay for the price hike. But as you mentioned, go ahead.
I guess here's what I'm wondering about, because I'm not an economist, but I understand what protectionist measures are. I don't like them. I also don't like America not making the majority of the goods it needs to make. I'd like to see more of it made here. Is there any reason why there aren't manufacturers in America who could make up the other 50%? And if so, why are they not doing it right now?
I think it's a matter of profitability and what the steel industry made a conscious decision that certain other areas of steel are growing and more profitable. For a long time, tin plate steel was gradually decreasing as an important element in the economy. You see a lot of innovation in things, packaging. We've gone from juice boxes to pouches to all kinds of new products. So,
right.
So tin has kind of, it's not quite the horse and buggy, but there are a lot of other uses for steel that have advanced. American steel has shoved their chips onto the table, as I mentioned before, in these other areas, like automobile manufacturing and heavy equipment. In 2018, President Trump instituted a very broad range of steel tariffs across many nations, very, very stiff penalties. It was very protectionist in some people's eyes. Whether you agree or disagree, the bottom line is it created an umbrella for companies like Cleveland-Cliffs and others to increase their investment in production of tin plate steel. But they didn't. they, again, invested in other types of steel and are shifting their volume towards more lucrative and profitable types of steel production.
I'm talking to Gerard Simica, who's chair of the free market group called Consumer Action for a Strong Economy. You know what this almost reminds me of, Ms. Simica, is I think it was Bush who put tariffs, it might have been Obama, put tariffs on like the low-cost automobile tires. And a lot of the American companies said, we don't make that stuff. That stuff's made in Asia. We make the expensive tires. But the regular little, tires you put on a Toyota Corolla that's 20 years old, that's made overseas. So the sanctions against, that protected American industry to make it, American industry wasn't interested in making it. It sounds like this is the same kind of thing. Am I right?
You are exactly 100% right. This is in order for tariffs can be effective if you find that countries are rigging the rules and playing unfairly. And the Section 232 petition that they're filing is normally what a president or a company might file in order to say this is a national security issue. It's very targeted towards one nation and usually towards a particular type of product. But they're doing a shotgun approach. They are filing this petition against 8 countries, some of our best trading partners like the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, South Korea, and hoping it sticks. And what's going to happen, of course, if it were to go through, these countries would retaliate against U.S. Exporters. Right. And so our businesses here would find it harder to get their products in. So it's all of us really versus Cleveland Cliffs. This will benefit them. This will help line their pockets. It will increase their margins and increase their prices. But all of that is going to come right out of the pockets of U.S. consumers.
Absolutely. That's Gerard Simica from Consumer Action for a Strong Economy. Sir, thank you very much. You've got the Lars Larson Show. Do you have investment properties you're considering selling and would like to learn how to defer the tax consequences? Then you need to call Equity Advantage and learn about a 1031 exchange. A 1031 exchange is a powerful investment tool. It enables you to keep a property's equity intact when it's used to acquire like-kind replacement property of equal or greater value and equity, even if you recently acquired the property. For over 30 years, Equity Advantage has been providing investors solutions for deferring taxes and maximizing the value of investments through a 1031 exchange. At Equity Advantage, we don't sell investments, but rather provide the tax deferment tools and expertise to facilitate their sale and transfer. Learn more by going to 1031exchange.com. or Google YouTube Equity Advantage for in-depth videos. Listen, you've worked hard for the money in your investments. Equity Advantage works hard to keep it yours.
Learn more about 1031 exchanges and Equity Advantage at 1031exchange.com. That's 1031exchange.com.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Remember the transgender shooter who attacked the Christian school in Nashville? And we've been waiting, because it happened back in March, we've been waiting to find out about the autopsy and the toxicology report, because we should learn a lot there. Except that I think there's a lot about that case that the authorities do not want to delve into. Let me get into the details on that in just a moment. First, welcome to a Tuesday on the Lars Larson Show. It's honestly provocative talk for the United States of America, and I'm glad to take your phone calls. If you want to dial in, it's 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com, and you can cast a vote in our Twitter poll. Today's question: since we know that Donald Trump was arraigned in federal court just a few hours ago, and I watched it as he arrived at the courthouse, I think that they should probably have wall-to-wall coverage on camera in court when there finally is a trial. We don't know exactly when that's going to be. The special counsel in this case says he's going to make it as quick as possible. Usually quick is not to the advantage of the person who is accused. And so we'll see how Donald Trump wants to play this. Has it changed my vote? No. I'm still going to vote for Donald Trump. I think he is the best president of the 21st century, and I think he'll make a great president come January of 2025. I think he's going to mop the floor with Joe Biden, assuming that Joe Biden is still around in the summer of next year to accept the Democrat Party's nomination. And if it happens to be somebody else, well, that's where the real question comes up, because I don't think the Democrats have anybody else. They've got Kamala Harris, not much of a choice. They've got Gavin Newsom from California. He's also not much of a choice, and he's made a mess of the state of California. And who else do the Democrats really have who has what it takes to be able to run for president of the United States? I've heard the crazy ideas about Michelle Obama running either as the prime candidate or as Joe Biden's vice president. I don't think that's likely. I think she likes being rich, and I think she likes being a former first lady, and I don't think she likes America much at all. Just take a look at some of the quotes from some of her speeches. She hates this country with a passion. The idea that she would tie herself to as vice president to Joe Biden, or even as the primary candidate, and take Barack Obama back to the White House, I don't think that's likely at all. I know people have a lot of fun talking about the idea, but I don't think it's going to happen. So you've got Donald Trump indicted and arraigned, and still, according to the polls, the odds-on choice to become not just the Republican nominee in the summer of next year, but also the elected president of the United States. So you've got that. Then you've got the story that most of the major media has been ignoring as much as they possibly can, and that is the FBI document that says the FBI has had for some time a source who told them, not only does he say that Joe Biden took a $5 million bribe from Ukraine back when he was vice president of the United States, and his son Hunter was serving on the board of directors of Burisma, and the bribe allegedly came from the natural gas company Burisma in Ukraine. But the former executive from the company apparently hung on to about 17 different audio recordings. 15 of them are supposed to be conversations that the Burisma executive had with Hunter Biden. The other 2 are alleged to be conversations that the Burisma executive had with Joe Biden himself. Now, if the proof is that solid, you've got conversations on audio tape between an executive of the natural gas company where Hunter Biden served on the board of directors in Ukraine, a company owned by a Ukrainian oligarch, and the vice president at the time of the United States, Joseph R. Biden. Yeah, I can imagine that's quite an implication. And I've pointed out to you before that last week, when the news of Donald Trump's indictment on federal charges, first time an American president has ever been so charged, came on the very same day that the Congress finally, after demanding that document from the FBI, they finally got their hands on the document, and all of a sudden Donald Trump gets indicted. I don't think the timing is coincidental. So I'm going to ask you in the Twitter poll, which one concerns you more, Trump's classified documents or Joe Biden's $5 million bribe allegation from Ukraine? I would go with the Joe bribe rather than the Donald Trump documents. I think that's the greater threat. You've got a president in the Oval Office right now who's alleged to have taken a $5 million bribe from a company in Ukraine where Americans are currently funding a war to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. That's our Twitter poll question. You can find it at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I joined the group a long time ago, and you can too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Now, what Epoch Times is reporting, and I like Epoch Times. I find their reporting very good. I've got no other tie to the company other than that. I admire their reporting. But consider this, about that Nashville Christian school shooter, a transgender individual, and yes, there were ties between that individual and the school, but the person was a troubled transgender person. And I think when I say troubled, I say that's an understatement when you consider what was done. The autopsy and toxicology report for the shooter show no positive findings of any toxicology in blood or urine samples that were performed. According to the autopsy and the toxicology reports released to the Epoch Times from the Nashville Medical Examiner, Nashville's police chief, John Drake, said that the shooter was under a doctor's care for an emotional disorder, but noted officials were unclear about what treatment she may have been receiving. Actually, because Audrey Hale was actually a biological male. The autopsy also included a summary of physical characteristics. So, if the shooter was under a doctor's care, but the doctor was prescribing medicine and it wasn't present in the shooter's body, or was prescribing medicine and the shooter wasn't taking the medicine, what should that tell us? Now, let me give you a little advice. If you're a small business owner, could you use a few $100,000? Well, employee retention tax credits, they're an incredible opportunity. Call the experts at Get My Funds. They've been around since the beginning of the pandemic, and they've already helped out about 1,500 small business owners, and they got about $300 million in extra funds. Get My Funds knows what they're doing. They have a team of CPAs who specialize in filing for these tax credits, and they're with you every step of the way, even if there's an audit. They stand behind their work with an audit safeguard. If you retain 5 or more W-2 employees during COVID, and even if you already received the Paycheck Protection Plan, the PPP money, you need to call Get My Funds, and do it now at 800-535-2950. This isn't a grant. It's not a loan. It's a tax refund. And there are no upfront fees to find out if you qualify. Go with a team you can trust at Get My Funds at 800-535-2950 or getmyfunds.com. That's getmyfunds.com. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. I love the fact that people like, New York lawmakers, legislators up in Albany. I live a long ways away from there, but I know what they do. They come up with crazy liberal ideas, and they think they're protecting the birds and the bees by restricting pesticides, but actually, it may only have an impact on the amount of food we're able to grow. Dr. Henry Miller joins me now, and he has the background to understand this one. He's a medical doctor and molecular biologist, now at the American Council on Science and Health. He was founding director of the FDA's Office of Biotechnology. Dr. Miller, welcome back.
Good to be with you, Lars. Thank you.
What is the state of New York doing that is so crazy when it comes to, because every time they talk about banning pesticides, I think, this probably means less food, more cost, and nothing good for consumers.
Yeah, well, this should be called the conclave of know-nothings. They've shown with this bill that they understand no aspect of the issue. So what they've done is to essentially ban a class of pesticides called neonics, or more formally neonicotinoids. They're very safe, they're very useful, and part of the reason that their application is so safe is they're not sprayed like many other pesticides. They're seed coatings. And so the seeds are coated with these. The seeds are then buried, and they're not exposed to birds or any other animals, or for that matter, bees primarily. There's just no reason to ban these. It's also intrinsically very low toxicity.
And by the way, Doc, let me display either my ignorance or you can straighten me out. Do I understand right? The neonics, this is actually stuff, this is nicotine. So could we also describe this stuff as largely natural in that it's either derived from tobacco or it's actually producing the same kind of chemical that tobacco plants produce?
Well, it's a derivative of nicotine, so it is synthetic, but natural or not, it's of low toxicity, and the method of application makes it particularly safe. And moreover, most of the commonly grown crops in New York State are not pollinated by bees anyway. Most of them are pollinated by the wind or self-pollinated. So there's no reason at all except pandering to activists who just don't like pesticides on principle for this bill. So I hope that the governor will veto it, but she's a Democrat, so who knows?
Well, by the way, Doc, there's another beekeeper. There's a guy I know who's a beekeeper. He's also involved in research on public policy issues, named Todd Myers. But he happens to be a beekeeper as one of his hobbies, and he's constantly telling me about the crazy stuff that goes on with bees, because we're always hearing, well, we're gonna end all the bees on planet Earth, or the populations are going through gigantic declines. And then he describes how people get this impression that there are a bunch of backyard beekeepers who are not part of the much, much bigger population of bees that are kept by the folks who do it as a profession. So in other words, these are like hobbyist beekeepers, and that what they do is they get all wound up about a subject, and they say, why, we've seen these big declines, except they're the people who are doing it as a hobby. It'd be like, I mean, I don't grow tomatoes. Tina does grow tomatoes most years, but it'd be like talking to Tina as your source on how the tomato population of America is going. She could say, oh, it's going great or it's going lousy, but it's so small, and yet a lot of the press goes right to these people and says, what's happening with bees? And they say, we've seen a sharp decline in our hives. And they're talking to people who represent maybe 1 or 2% of the bees in the entire country, and then trying to make public policy. Does that ring true in this kind of situation as well? That this is where the complaints are from?
That is very true. The phrase that the press often picks up is the bee-pocalypse, as in apocalypse. And there is no apocalypse, except perhaps among these amateur beekeepers. There are two problems that bees do have. One is that there are mites called varroas that infest beehives and spread diseases. And that's what causes problems with amateur beekeepers. The professionals know how to avoid that. The other problem is that, and this is an interesting situation, bees are actually trucked across the country, around the country, and they're like livestock that are commercially spread to pollinate various crops.
Yep.
So in the appropriate season, tractor trailers filled with bees come to California to pollinate the almond trees, and that puts stress on bees that sometimes causes localized declines. But overall, the number of bees and the number of hives has increased since the advent of neonic pesticides. So there you have it. The New York legislators have no idea about any of this.
Let's get to the crop production side of this. If they say we're going to ban the neonics, the neonicotinoids, what's that going to do to crop production if we say you can't use this anymore and you're pretty well strapped down, you can't use other chemicals, then is there an alternative, and what's the effect going to be on food supply?
Well, the alternative is that farmers will have to shift to other crops that for which there are effective pesticides, always more toxic than neonics, ironically, but many of the crops that neonics are used on will be less productive, or farmers will abandon them entirely. So prices will go up for produce for consumers. All bad outcomes.
I mean, because all of this stuff, I don't think people understand that if you say to the farmer, you can't use these anymore, he says, fine, I'll grow something else. And if the number, now it doesn't mean any production of any crop is going to go to zero. But if, say, you get 50% of the people who grow a certain kind of crop to go away, the other 50% are going to make bank because their crops will be very much in demand. It just means consumers will pay a whole lot more money.
Yeah, when we saw a similar situation recently in Europe, the sugar beet crop in particular was decimated. And guess what? Sugar prices went up. Some sugar refiners went out of business, moved out of Europe. And that's what happens. Bad policies have consequences, is the bottom line.
Yeah, it's funny because, Henry, years ago, I was doing a story about places that sold grow lights for pot before pot became legal in many places. And I was in a store that sold all this stuff, sort of a commercial grade farm product store. It sold grow lights, but they also sold chemicals and everything else. And I got to talking to the guy who ran it. And he was a young guy, but he said, hey, see, I want to show you something. He says, see this stuff? He says, this is the all-natural kind of, pesticide of one kind or another. It wasn't neonics. And I said, yeah. He says, the all-natural one costs about 5 times as much money as the chemical one. I said, yeah. He says, but what really makes the story great, the all-natural one is about 5 times as carcinogenic as the chemical version, which costs a whole lot less money. And I said, well, does anybody buy this stuff? And he says, oh, yeah, I get customers all the time who say, I want the all-natural one. And he says, yeah, and you're going to pay a whole lot more money, and it's actually more toxic for you than the chemical, the synthetic variety. And I wish I could remember the name of the chemical because it was a great comparison. Buy the one that's all natural and everything else. Pay a lot more money, have more toxicity, or buy the totally synthetic one that's a lot cheaper and a lot safer to use. He said, but there are people who insist that's what they want. That's Dr. Henry Miller, the Glenn Swagger Distinguished Fellow at the American Council on Science and Health, former founding director of the FDA's Office of Biotechnology, and you're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Coming up next, we'll talk about, and I know it's sad, queering Jesus. Can you believe that? That's next. And Joe, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I'll be glad to get to your phone calls and emails in a moment, but I have to do 2 things. Number one, I have to talk about a subject that is very, very disturbing to me. And as usual, if something is disturbing to me, it's because I've got a dog in the fight. In this case, I am a Protestant Christian. I mention that from time to time. So if somebody says, Lars, you only believe that because you believe in the Word of God, you believe in the Bible, and you believe in Jesus Christ. I do, as a matter of fact. In fact, most days of most weeks, Tina and I spend some time in the book every single night. I think that's a healthy thing to do, even if you think you know that book very well. It is full of wonderful things. What it is not full of is a lot of in fact, if you read the book thoroughly, you understand that while Jesus thought a lot himself of people being faithful, he was very distrustful of religious institutions because they not only frequently disappoint, they often pervert the Word of God. And I got to thinking about that whole idea, because it flows throughout the Bible that religious institutions, religion can often be very, very deceptive. God and the Bible and Jesus Christ are not, religions are. Now, if you're not a person of faith, you might think, well, what the heck are you talking about? I would say the Bible is the revealed Word of God. And I don't often talk a lot about religion on this show, although it seems to intersect, to use a popular word these days, with a lot of the things we talk about. But when I saw this piece from Real Clear Investigations, and full credit to them for writing about this subject, because as I warned you ahead of time, it's a little bit on the side of uncomfortable. There is something going on involving what is called queer theory and queering Jesus. Now, I can tell you as a reporter for the last 48 years, there have been a lot of times I have covered gay rights issues, and we were told for a long time that using the Q word was almost as bad as using the N word, that queer was an off-limits term. You could not use it, except these days, there are an awful lot of people, LGBTQ, who are advocating for gay rights who use that word all the time. Now, what does it mean to be queering Jesus? Well, let me give you a couple of examples. And again, full credit to our friends at Real Clear Investigations. A Presbyterian church goes viral online for marking the Transgender Day of Visibility with a public prayer to the God of pronouns. The congregants of this church, and I grew up in the Presbyterian church, but it wasn't like this. First Presbyterian of Iowa City, pay obeisance to the God of trans being, given due glory to the great they, them. Now, if you're a Christian like me, you say, I have no idea what you're talking about, number one. Number two, we're made in God's image, and when you tell God, you made me a boy, but I became a girl, or you made me as a girl, and I became a boy, before we even get to XY chromosomes, you say, something is wrong with people who decide that the way that they were made in God's image is to be manipulated or even corrupted, even mutilated. And there I'm talking about what's being done to children. Second example, from their investigation. The United Methodist Church boasts the first drag queen in the world to become a certified candidate for ordination. This traveling minister, who describes drag ministry as a divine duty, is lauded by one Florida pastor as an angel in heels after appearing at the church in a sequin dress to deliver a children's sermon and denounce the privilege of whiteness and cisness. Cis means you're part of the conventional culture, meaning you're heterosexual, you're normal, except you can't use normal without getting into trouble these days. Probably triggers somebody out there. At Duke University, the Methodist-affiliated Divinity School, pastors in training and future religious leaders conduct a pride worship service in which they glorify the great queer one, fluid and ever-becoming one. Does this start to tell you why this is so sick and perverted? 2,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years ago, the people who wrote the Bible, they warned you about what religion would do. Religion would be misused by man, perverted by man for both power and money. Power and money. The service, in this case at Duke University, led off with a prayer honoring God as queerness incarnate. You are drag queen and trans man and gender fluid, incapable of limiting your vast expression of beauty. Now, does that fit with anybody else's read of the Bible? Because it doesn't fit with mine. Maybe a naysayer can set me straight. Final example. The Presbyterian News Service offers an online educational series such as Queering the Bible. That was in 2022. And Queering the Prophets 2023 during Pride Month. A commentary in the former refers to Jesus, and I can't even say that word on the air, this eccentric backside freak who challenged first-century gender norms. This is how sick and perverted that this has become. The idea that you're going to use religion, abuse religion, corrupt religion, and mutilate religion in name of LGBTQ policy. In this form of worship, says the Real Clear Investigations piece, queering encourages the faithful to disrupt and destabilize the assumptions behind what they call heteronormity and related social structures like monogamy, marriage, and capitalism, all of which, by the way, are present in the book, but apparently they don't like them. These provocative theologians and ministers assert that queerness is not only natural and healthy, but is celebrated in the Bible. Well, I have the Patriots Bible, which is the Geneva Bible, the one the Pilgrims brought to America, the best version. You got the King James Version, which I don't particularly like because King James merely produced that Bible for people to read because he didn't like the fact that the Geneva Bible actually made the Bible accessible to the public for the very first time. That was in about 1550. Before that time, the Church of England decreed that average folks weren't even allowed to read the Bible, that Bibles could only be produced in Latin, which most of the people in the population could not read. They say, thus it is in the presence of the sexually marginalized, like a gay bathhouse or a bondage dungeon, where we find the presence of Jesus, so they say. In the language of queer theology, queerness is a sign of God's love because queer flesh is sacramental flesh. I don't know where you find that in the Bible either. And they say traditional Christianity has been corrupted into a systemic option against hedonistic love. Many other queer theologians, so-called, have developed these themes as described chronologically in Radical Love and Introduction to Queer Theology. This is what they're doing. And believe me, the people who wrote the Bible and Jesus himself and God warned, because not every word in the Bible is written by God, but it is the revealed word of God. They warned you. Religion, organized religion, would be used. It would be abused and used for power and money. And I think this is part of that. Let's go to Matt in North Carolina. Hey, Matt, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
Yes, sir, Lars. Nice to talk to you again. I have the opinion question of the whole day or week or month, and I'll make it real fast.
Okay.
In your opinion, which I have millions of people waiting to hear your opinion because we value it, and in your opinion, why does why does the Biden crime family get away with whatever they want, never get touched?
Because they have a lot of money and they have a lot of power and they have a lot of connections. And at this point, they're playing every one of those cards to their advantage. You're listening to the Lars Larson. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I know that everybody in the mainstream media is focused on Donald Trump's indictment and also on his arraignment in federal court today. But I think there's something out there that if the mainstream media starts paying attention to it, 15 audio recordings between an executive of Burisma, the now well-known natural gas company from Ukraine owned by a Ukrainian oligarch, and 2 recordings, so it's a total of 17. 15 of them are Hunter Biden and the top executive at Burisma, and 2 of them are with Joe Biden and this top executive. And you would think the idea that the current president of the United States might have taken a $5 million bribe from a foreign company in a country where we're now funding a multi-$100 billion war would draw a lot more attention. Evita Duffy joins me now, who's staff writer at The Federalist and co-founder of the Chicago Thinker. Evita, I'm glad somebody in Chicago is thinking because I don't think most of their elected officials are. Welcome back. Evita? I don't think Evita is there. Donovan, would you mind checking with Evita? Because it doesn't sound like she's on the line. She may have stepped away for a moment. But as she points out, Iowa Republican, and I've told you this before, Chuck Grassley, senator, has said that he has 15 audio recordings of conversations between him, Hunter Biden, and the Burisma executive. Evita, welcome back.
Hey, sorry about that.
No worries. We all get caught. My producers would tell you every once in a while I get caught away from the mic, although I try to keep it to a minimum. Tell me what we know about what Chuck Grassley has finally, exposed to the American public, giving a speech yesterday saying there are audio recordings of not just Hunter Biden and this Burisma executive, but also at least 2 recordings of Vice President Joe Biden that were kept as kind of an insurance policy, implicating Joe Biden in a bribery scandal of multi-million-dollar size?
I mean, totally laid it out perfectly. This is an incredible story. The information about the audio recordings is in the FD 1023 form, which the FBI had possession of, and that part about the audio recordings was redacted by the FBI from Congress. They didn't want Congress, let alone the American people, to know that this Burisma executive has audio recordings between Biden and his son Hunter. So I mean, this is an explosive story, and I love that you brought up in the beginning the media, because everybody's focused on Trump, just like the FBI, the deep state, the corp media, Trump, and we have this explosive story that is embroiling the sitting president of the United States in a bribery scheme, and of course his son too. And nobody's talking about it. We're all still talking about Trump, which is exactly what they want us to do. On the same day that we heard about this bribery scheme, it broke news last week. On the same week that happened, we also have Trump getting charged with 37 counts from the FBI for mishandling classified documents, something that Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and Barack Obama had all done themselves. This is an incredible story that nobody is talking about.
Well, and in fact, at this point, we don't actually know for a fact that Joe Biden doesn't still have classified documents, not from his time as president now, but from his time then, because it seemed like, remember when they found a trove, and then they found another trove, and then they searched again and found another trove. And then his lawyer said, oh, yeah, we've been going through a bunch of documents. And when they say, well, you know, when Donald Trump's lawyers went through some of the documents, or the poor guy who acts as his valet, and he's going to be charged, are they going to charge Joe Biden's lawyers, who were sent over to the Chi-Com-funded think tank at UPenn to go through the documents? I don't think they had clearance. But here's what I want to know that I'm most curious about that I haven't found anywhere, and that is, does the FBI have the recordings? Do we know?
So in the reference, what we know is that the recordings exist. So that's what the person who was interviewed by the FBI said and was then recorded on this form that the Burisma executive has these recordings. It's unclear whether the FBI has these recordings, whether a whistleblower has these recordings. What we know is that this executive has these recordings, and we don't obviously we don't know the name of this executive. That's been redacted as well. So there's a lot of questions, but this is a really, like I said, this is a really explosive story. And we talk about FBI malfeasance. We don't know. First of all, we don't know if they're even investigating this properly. And this is an unclassified document. Straight up, we should be allowed to see what's on this 1023 form.
Yep.
They are redacting information on an unclassified document, not just to the American people, but to Congress, to the Oversight Committee. This is a ridiculous, crazy story that tells us just how corrupt the FBI is. They have completely lost all trust with the American people. Instead of investigating a bribery scheme with the president, they're going after parents at school board meetings who don't want their kids to be indoctrinated with racist curriculum. And they're investigating Catholics who go to Latin mass and putting ridiculous charges on pro-lifers who show up to abortion clinics. Their priorities are completely backward. And this is what I've been saying to everybody. When we talk about 2024, and I don't like talking about 2024 because we have so many things to focus on, but if we're going to talk about 2024, we have to be asking every single candidate, what are you going to be doing about the deep state? Because it is the most important question, the most important issue facing our country right now, because they have completely lost all trust in the American people, and it needs to be addressed.
Well, Evita, let me ask you one other thing that I haven't found anywhere else. How long has the FBI been sitting on this information?
And we don't know. No, we don't. There are so many questions that people have about this. And I also just to talk about Biden, who he is as a person, right? Because he ran on this unity messaging, right? That he's a benign figure. He's like a grandpa, and we're all going to vote for him because he's, this guy that's going to bring the country together. And as it turns out, he has been radical, and as more and more we've learned how much he and his family are involved in this bribery scheme, in money laundering, and all these cases. So we have to ask, who is Biden as a person? Because there's been videos going around on Twitter where they show him talking about gay marriage. He didn't support gay marriage in 2008, and now he's inviting to the White House trannies with topless to parade around on the White House lawn.
A man with fake breasts who takes his, not shirt, but the top of his blouse off and then bounces around. Evita, this is the crazy thing. All the time I've covered courts and cops, the usual excuse was, we can't let you see this. It's still under investigation. But the FBI doesn't want to say that they're currently investigating Joe Biden, because that would be a bombshell and it would force the mainstream media to look at it. Evita, I'm going to ask people to take a look at the stories you've written, both at Chicago Thinker and at the Federalist. That is Evita Duffy. Glad to get your emails. Send those emails to talk@LarsLarson.com and tell Alexa to play the Lars Larson Show.
This has been going on for 7 years. There's never been anything like what's happened. I'm an innocent man. I'm an innocent person. It's called election interference. They're trying to destroy your reputation so they can win an election.
Yes, that is Donald Trump. And no, it did not come from inside the courtroom in Florida today, although it has happened. An American president has been arraigned on federal charges, a federal indictment, 37 charges against Donald Trump. He has now been arraigned in Florida, and he has told the court he is not guilty. He pleaded not guilty. That's what you do in court. You tell the judge, I'm an innocent man, just like he did in that soundbite from just a couple of days ago. Welcome to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I want to say a few things about what has happened and about where it's likely to go and about how it's likely to turn out for American voters and for this great country, which right now is under the control of a demented old man who can barely walk across a stage, has no idea where he is most of the time, and is making exceedingly bad decisions for the whole country. But we call this the best conversation in talk journalism for a reason. So if you want to join that conversation, you are always welcome at 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, that is, you disagree with my point of view, you think Donald Trump ought to be locked up for decades and fined millions of dollars and he should go to prison for doing what every single president has done, taken home classified documents, and including a lot of non-presidents like Joe Biden about 49 years ago, when Senator Joe Biden illegally took classified documents home and then hung on to them for the better part of half a century with no consequence whatsoever. And welcome to the Radio Northwest Network. We serve the Pacific Northwest states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho with honestly provocative talk radio. And we're glad to have you join us. If you want to send emails, it's talk@larslarson.com. And we'll get to our Twitter poll just a bit from now. But you can find it two places, at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Well, Donald Trump had some advisors who were very concerned that when he showed up at court today, that there would be trouble, that there might be violence, that it could explode into a disaster. I think he told them not to worry about it. And do you know why? It didn't happen. We haven't seen the kind of trouble that they actually predict, the kind of trouble that Nancy Pelosi wanted on January 6, 2021, when she invited a documentary film crew to her office because she was just sure that something bad was going to happen on January 6, and she was going to blame it on Donald Trump. Let me remind you that this is just the latest episode in a long-running saga called Get Trump. At least from my point of view, that's what's going on here. The Democrats realize that Donald Trump right now, according to the polls, and despite all the negative coverage that he has had from the left-wing mainstream media, which always favors Democrats, never favors conservatives, and they want Donald Trump out of the race. And they want him out of the race for the worst of reasons, because they know that he's going to get the nomination from the Republicans, and they know to a fair certainty that he's going to mop the floor with Joe Biden if Joe Biden is still running when November of next year rolls around. Fact is, Joe Biden announced back in April. Have you seen him out on the campaign trail? Not at all. He does show up at a few public appearances, usually so he can stumble over his words and then stumble over his own feet. We have an absentee president right now. The guy who's sitting in the Oval Office, who I think got there through cheating in November of 2020. And if you take a look at the numbers from that election, you understand that cheating had to happen. Joe Biden, somehow campaigning from his basement of his home in Delaware, managed to outdo even Barack Hussein Obama, who I didn't like the guy's policies. I didn't have any problem with him personally, but I don't like the guy's policies. But he managed to generate a gigantic increase in voter participation in his first election. Now, by the time the second one, 2012, rolled around, an awful lot of black Americans had realized, gee, I went out and voted for the first black presidential candidate of a major political party in America, and I thought he was going to straighten out some things for black Americans, and Barack Obama disappointed them hugely. I understand that, but that somehow Joe Biden, by running a phantom campaign, a campaign where he almost never showed up in public, almost never submitted any kind of questioning at all against a candidate who was willing to talk to the media anytime the media wanted to, that Joe Biden outdid Donald Trump? Yeah, I guess you can believe those numbers if you want to, but that's what it is. So Donald Trump has been arraigned in court. He has told the judge he is not guilty. He is facing 37 charges, of which the vast majority, 31 of them, have to do with espionage charges under a statute that I might say has been questioned by lawyers from both the left and the right. They all seem to agree that the espionage law passed in 1917 during World War I is almost certainly unconstitutional. It has been used in most cases. The left hated that law because they said that law is used to silence free speech. And some very prominent free speakers like Eugene Debs, the infamous socialist, and people who argued that the draft during World War I was unconstitutional under the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. There were people who got thrown in jail for speaking out. Now, that phenomenon is back with us thanks to the pandemic, where the government has decided You can't speak. If you speak, we're going to come after you. We may charge you with a crime. In this case, they're going to go after Donald Trump, not because of that, but because they can't beat him in the election next year. The American public want him back. They want Joe Biden gone. They want inflation gone. They want high gas prices gone. They want the hundreds of billions that are being sent to Ukraine to stop. They want a president who actually puts America first. Now, that's not unusual, but it's something that Americans want. And the Democrats are scared to death of it because they don't have a candidate who can beat that kind of idea. To your calls now. Let's go first to Ryan. Hey, Ryan, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Lars, I got to say I listen to you all the time. I absolutely appreciate you sticking your neck out there and speaking up for all of us out here.
Thank you.
I called in because you said that our country is controlled by a demented old man. And that's you're speaking about Joe Biden. But I've got to disagree with you.
And well, I will tell you this. In theory, he's the titular head of the United States of America. I think I'm going to agree with you if you're headed toward an idea that somebody else is actually calling the shots. And I've said that a number of times. Most of Joe Biden's closest staff members used to work for Barack Obama, and I think they're still taking their orders from Barack Obama. And he's running as his third term in office. He's just running Joe like a puppet.
You know he is. And if you look back to the interview that Barack Obama had with Stephen Colbert, he said if I could work it out to where I was just in my sweats in the basement calling all the shots and there was just a front man, he would absolutely take that deal. And I think
you're absolutely right. And that's what's happening. And
Obama
that makes Joe Biden's presidency all the more fraudulent. Glad to be with you, and always glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'll be glad to get to your phone calls and emails. If you want to join the best conversation, boy, talk about a topic to talk about. This involves your kids. It involves billions of dollars of medical treatment that, to a large extent, is going to end up being paid for by the American taxpayer. And then it comes to the healthcare institutions that have decided this is an extraordinarily bad idea. What I'm talking about is so-called gender-affirming care. Let me point out what has happened recently. In a lot of cases, America, for good or bad, takes a look at our Western European friends, other countries that are alike us, but they're not the same as us. France, Germany, Great Britain, and other places. And we say, why, they do it this way over there, that must be the right way to do it. Only now, what happens when those folks start to say, hey, this gender-affirming stuff, like giving puberty blockers to kids, and then later on perhaps surgery, and in a lot of cases, not just the surgery, but the puberty blockers are undoable. That is, once you've given those blockers to a child, and then the child gains a few more years and exits puberty, and that process has been blocked, going back and undoing the changes is in some cases extraordinarily difficult. In other cases, it's just it's impossible. It's a practical impossibility. So consider this. Our friend Wesley Smith, who writes for the Discovery Institute about human exceptionalism, he says the National Health Service in England has now banned the administration of puberty blockers to adolescents who feel they are a different sex. So imagine the practical side of this. A boy says, I really don't feel like a boy. I feel more like a girl. He's 15 years old. You take him to the National Health Service, which is the healthcare institution that cares for almost everybody in Great Britain except the extraordinarily wealthy, meaning they have national health care, and not in a good way, at least from my point of view. There are people in this country who say we should have universal health care. What they're talking about is what the National Health Service provides to people in Great Britain. And they say it's great, you don't have to pay anything. Well, that's not true because you're paying for it through your taxes, and your taxes are higher because of it. What's also true is that at least in America, if you go to a hospital, a clinic, a doctor for any kind of medical care, you can get a second opinion. You can also shop around for care that is less expensive. In Great Britain, as I said, unless you're extraordinarily wealthy, everybody goes to the National Health Service. You have no choices. There is no second opinion. And if the National Health Service says, yeah, you have this sickness and there is a treatment, but we don't offer it, you can't find an alternative because the National Health Service decides in Great Britain what treatments are covered and what treatments are not covered. In America, at least you have the opportunity to say, well, if you don't offer that treatment, I'll go to somebody who does. In Great Britain, for the most part, you can't do that at all. So it's a bad system. But the system has, until recently, offered puberty blockers to kids. And now they've decided it's a terrible idea. They've said, unless you're doing some kind of formal clinical trial, we're going to stop doing this altogether. And they also say social, what they call gender affirmation, will not be the automatic approach taken for children who come up with what they call gender incongruence, which is effectively saying you're a boy and you think you're a girl, or you're a girl and you think you're a boy instead. They're not going to just automatically jump to puberty blockers. The clinical management approach, as Wesley writes, should be open to exploring all the different ways, options for kids and even for young adults who are experiencing this problem. He says a significant proportion of children and young people who are concerned about or distressed by issues of gender experience mental health, neurodevelopmental, and or personal, family, or social complexities. A fancy way of saying you got trouble upstairs. The relationship between those and gender incongruence may not be readily apparent. Let me point out to you that a couple of months ago, I told you about a brand new study out of Canada in which they looked and they said it turns out that an awful lot of kids who say they have gender incongruence, that is, born a boy, say you're a girl, or vice versa, are also autistic kids. They're high-functioning autistic kids. And there are at least a few psychologists who seem to think that the reason that they're seeking this out is that an awful lot of kids with autism do not feel very welcome by other kids or by society. But they find out that if they announce suddenly that they've gone transgender, all of a sudden they're socially acceptable again. They say the new approach will ban puberty blocking except in the structured circumstances of a formal study. Now, here's the question I've got for you. In America right now, the current estimate of how much money is made every year right now from what they call gender affirmation care, they try to make it sound all warm and fuzzy, is $1.9 billion a year. But the healthcare industry also says that the growth of that is expected to be 11% per year and that it will compound. And that within a couple of years, it'll be a $5 billion industry, if not bigger. And you say, well, hold on, what's driving this? Good medical care or somebody wants to make a lot of money? And we've already seen examples in America where hospital administrators have gone to conferences and they're told, look, you give these kids a little bit of drugs and you make a lot of money. And then later when they want to have surgery, you make a lot of money. And you provide all the care around that, and you make a lot of money. So what's driving this? Trying to do the right thing for boys and girls who are confused about who they are, or is it about making money? And as Wesley Smith points out, let's not forget that Norway, France, Sweden, and Finland, which as he points out are not exactly parts of the Bible Belt, are also pursuing a more rational approach, saying, we're not just going to automatically give puberty blockers to kids. It doesn't make any sense. And by the way, the approach is far more similar to laws of Florida and Tennessee than states like California and Washington and the rest of the gender affirmation cartel. And why? Because it's tied to money. If you've got a whole bunch of money to be made by taking little boys, chemically castrating them and turning them into girls, or taking little girls and giving them puberty blockers and then doing double mastectomies on girls, some of whom very deeply, regret, I guess is the best way to put it. People like Chloe Cole, who went public and said, look, they did this to me when I was a kid, and I wasn't old enough to understand what was going on, but it seemed like something that was something I should do. Later on, when you decide, can you put it back the way it was? The answer is no. Now imagine that happening to your son or daughter. And then imagine the states that are now making it legal for social workers, teachers, counselors, and their schools to arrange this kind of healthcare treatment, as they call it. I don't think it's healthcare treatment. I think it's mutilation of children. But no matter what you think of it, do you think your son or daughter should do it without you being consulted and without you getting a chance to object to what's being done? Because I don't, and I'd be glad to take a naysayer call on it. Hey, what if you could help turn back the clock and help your dog, like my dog, Sir Winston, be like a puppy again, no matter what their age is? And that's why Dr. Marty developed Nature's Blend, because your dog needs a diet full of real cuts of meat, similar to what they'd eat in the wild. Dogs go bonkers for Dr. Marty's Pets Nature's Blend. When given the choice between Nature's Blend and the giant online retailer's #1 bestseller in dry dog food, a study shows 29 out of 30 dogs choose Nature's Blend first. I got to tell you, Sir Winston Churchill, our Bernese Mountain Dog, he loves it. Tori from Tulsa says, my fur baby is so eager to eat it. Other dog foods I've tried give my sweet boy issues with allergies. As soon as we switched over to Dr. Marty's, all those issues went away. Give your dog a food they'll love and help support the youthful energy, healthy skin, easy digestion, and happy full life. For a limited time, claim 54% off Nature's Blend and receive a free pack of premium dog treats from Dr. Marty's Pets. Go to drmartypets.com. That's /pets, drmartypets.com/pets, or text pets to 511-511. That's text pets to 511-511. Study available on request. Data rates may apply. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and we live in interesting times like the old Confucian curse. For the first time in our nation's history, a former president of the United States has been indicted by the federal government. And I thought we'd talk about that with John Malcolm, who's vice president of the Institute for Constitutional Government at the Heritage Foundation. John, welcome back.
Good to be with you, Lars.
So what should we make of that just at the outset, the idea that the Biden administration has effectively arrested and charged Joe Biden's primary competitor in next year's presidential election?
Yeah, look, this is uncharted and unprecedented territory. Obviously, this is now the second indictment that former President Trump faces, the first one by Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney. Those charges are serious, but I think they're very weak. These charges are far more serious and I think comprehensible to the American public. So, he's been charged. It's a 38-count indictment, combined indictment against Donald Trump and his co-defendant, Walt Nauta. The former president's named in 37 of those counts. 31 of them are for the unlawful retention of documents that, carry national security and national defense information. And then he's alleged to have disclosed that to people who didn't have the requisite clearances to see them. He is also alleged with Mr. Nauta to have moved these boxes of documents around to try to prevent his own attorneys from seeing them. His attorneys were trying to look through the boxes of documents in his possession to comply with the grand jury subpoena. And so the allegation is by moving these things around and keeping them away from his attorneys and from the grand jury, he obstructed justice. And then there's an allegation that he lied when he had directed his attorneys to say that he had no more documents of classified markings in his possession. These are serious charges, but we have certainly crossed a Rubicon by charging a former president who is not only a former president, but as you point out, the leading contender for a rematch with the current president, Joe Biden.
Well, let me ask you about this, because let's break it down. I'm not a lawyer, so I work at a disadvantage to that. But some of the charges have to do with the Espionage Act of 1917, do they not?
Right. Yes.
Okay.
So the 31 counts of unlawful retention of national defense information are charged under the Espionage Act.
31 of the 37, and almost every lawyer I can find commentary on over the years has said this thing's probably unconstitutional because it's usually used to silence political opponents. Was all the way back to, I think, to 1917 when they went after Eugene Debs, and said, you're a socialist and you're trying to tell people not to cooperate with the draft. We're going to throw you in prison. So is that act even constitutional?
Yeah, I think it is. It's been challenged many times. I'm not quite sure I see the analogy between a Eugene Debs who's thrown into prison for speaking out. He has a First Amendment right, and somebody having access to our nation's most sensitive secrets. Here it's alleged that he had documents that showed potential battle plans against another country. It's supposed to, other reports have said that country is Iran. It talked about our military capabilities, military capabilities of our allies, our nuclear capabilities, and nuclear capabilities and military capabilities of our enemies. I'm not aware of anything that says that an act that protects those documents is unconstitutional, and I don't think that any motion challenging the constitutionality of the Espionage Act would fly.
Okay, so we've dealt with that piece of it. What about the piece? And I know people are going to say, well, this is just your objection saying they did it too. But we have Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State, who never had any authority to declassify documents. Donald Trump did. And she actually admitted to destroying documents. And Jim Comey says, well, nobody responsible would ever consider charges against her. We got Joe Biden, who had boxes and boxes of this stuff, some by his own account, going back, some of the documents going back 49 years when he had no authority to take them at all as a U.S. Senator.
Right.
And somehow Trump is held to a different standard. Is the double standard defense that you're only using this for political reasons, is that a defense that's going to work for Trump?
Well, he's certainly going to say that this is selective prosecution and that nobody not named Donald Trump would have been charged with this. Joe Biden is still under investigation by a special counsel himself. His name is Rob Hur. You are absolutely correct about Hillary Clinton. I mean, this is a hurdle that Jack Smith is going to have to overcome, is that there is a perception that the FBI and the Department of Justice are not acting in a politically neutral manner. Hillary Clinton probably being the most egregious example. She had no business to be transmitting classified information into and through the server that she had set up at her home with Bill Clinton in Chappaqua, New York, or over her cell phones. The FBI did not execute a search warrant on that home in Chappaqua. Instead, they allowed her attorneys to go through this material, turn over whatever they thought was responsive, and then she had the server whitewashed with something called bleach bit and destroyed the cell phones. And Jim Comey came out and said, look, we think that she was grossly negligent, but we don't have any evidence that she intended to do something with the classified information or retain the classified information. I would note, by the way, that gross negligence in terms of the handling of classified information is also a criminal offense under the Espionage Act. And that as the FBI director, it was not his decision about who gets prosecuted and doesn't get prosecuted. That's made by the Department of Justice, by the Attorney General. There are other instances that you could point to. Recently, John Durham came out with a scathing report that just skewered the FBI for its conduct of Operation Crossfire Hurricane. That was the investigation into alleged collusion between the Trump campaign and Russian officials. And it was all based on a completely made-up dossier by Christopher Steele, who was paid by the Clinton campaign. And none of this information was ever verified, yet the Department of Justice presented it to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And even when they learned some of the information was false, they did not correct that information when they went back to the FISA court to get previous warrants reauthorized. There are other examples. You could talk about labeling parents who complain at school board meetings as domestic terrorists, going after abortion protesters, but not going after people who vandalize family counseling clinics. The FBI has led with its chin and is largely to blame for the perception that justice is not being dished out in an even-handed manner. President Trump is certainly going to raise these issues. Whether they're going to be meritorious in terms of getting the charges dismissed remains to be seen, but it certainly very much paints a background that will color this prosecution.
Well, and Smith has promised a quick trial. So if that truly happens, I know in the federal court system sometimes things can move quickly, but if that happens, what's a trial like that going to look like? I mean, in terms of the information presented and the kind of spectacle it's going to create as we're 18 months from the next election.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's up to President Trump, really, how quickly the trial takes place. He does have a speedy trial, right, under both the Constitution and by statute. But if he files pretrial motions while those motions are pending before a court, that tolls the time. It stops the clock for a speedy trial act. So how quickly it happens is largely within his hands. Look, this is classified information, presumably, very, very secret. A lot of these documents were at the top secret level, so the judge is going to have to do something to try to get that information out so that the jury knows about it without it being disclosed in a way that would reveal sources and methods and possibly endanger people who are cooperating with us overseas. Anytime you have a classified information case, there are those sorts of issues. That's why they usually plead out. But here, of course, former President Trump has said there's no way in hell that he is going to plead, and I believe him.
I believe him as well, and I imagine it probably won't go as quickly as they think, although maybe it's to his advantage. Quickly get in there and say, put your case in front of the American public. John, thanks very much. I appreciate the time.
Good to be with you, Lars.
Thank you, sir. That's John Malcolm, who's vice president of the Institute for Constitutional Government at the Heritage Foundation. We'll be back. I'll get to your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm glad to get to your phone calls and emails. As we say, we promise that this is the best conversation in talk journalism, and you can be part of it. You've probably been hearing some reports that inflation has started to moderate. Now, I understand that, figures lie and liars figure. But I want to know whether or not these numbers are actually good news or are they just being spun a certain direction. And the guy I turn to in this case is Ryan Young, who's a senior fellow with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Ryan, welcome back, and tell us, are we finally getting Joe Biden's inflation under control?
Hey, Lars, thanks for having me on. It'll take some time, but yes, we are past the worst. Today's numbers were overall good, some causes for concern, but we'll know more tomorrow because every 6 weeks, the Federal Reserve has a meeting where they decide on interest rates. So tomorrow afternoon, we'll find out what they do there, and that'll have an even bigger impact than today's numbers.
Okay, so how much has it moderated? Because I always like to tell, there are news organizations that love to do 12-month comparisons. They'll say, well, it's really lower than it was 12 months ago. My benchmark is mid-January of 2021 when Joe Biden took the oath, and I think inflation actually sat at 2% at that point. Where are we officially today?
It peaked at 9%. The goal is 2%. Today's reading was 4%.
So we're only 100% higher than the day Joe took the oath of office.
I'll take it over 450% higher, but yes. And
okay, so will I.
Unfortunately, it's probably going to stay that high for a while, but we'll see.
But it strips. And by the way, is there compounding involved in this? Because if it's 4% higher than what? Than a year ago?
That's
prices?
Exactly right.
So
That's
in other words,
right. So
where were we a year ago?
Well, a year ago, inflation was closer to 7 or 8%. It's been slowly going down. The trouble is Congress, with its spending binges, and the Federal Reserve, with its general carelessness, are making it a lot harder for inflation to finally come back to earth, to that 2% range where we want it.
See, I guess I think about the compounding effect that if you're at 2% one year and then you're at 4% the next year, it's double. But if we're 4% up over the last 12 months and we were at 7% a year ago, we're still getting people's paychecks are being ripped to pieces by the inflation. And are the paychecks keeping up?
Barely. And for a lot of people, no. For a bit of context, this all began with COVID. And since then, the dollar through inflation has devalued somewhere between 15 and 20%. That's just since COVID hit in 2020.
So a big chunk of it was COVID, but it was also the government's response to COVID, correct? I mean, COVID was what it was, but the government's response was a choice. And the government chose to shovel out a lot of money, not just during the pandemic, but even now after the pandemic, they're still, to a certain extent, shoveling out a lot of money. How much of the inflation is being driven by the government's big shovel full of money?
Oh, just about all of it. When COVID hit, the government's response was to increase the money supply by 40%. The key rule to inflation is the money supply. You print a bunch of money, you're going to get inflation. 40% growth in that over 2 years, 20% per year, compared to just 4% growth in the real economy. That was what caused almost double-digit inflation, and we're still dealing with the after effects now, and I think we will be for at least another year or more.
All right, so if we really wanted to get rid of the inflation, the Fed could come out and say, well, it's moderated, so let's jack it up. Let's jack up interest rates some more. I know that does damage. I don't like it either. But if they did, would that bring inflation back down much quicker?
It would. The trouble is the Fed, they say they're independent, but they're tied. If Congress wants to do another multi-trillion-dollar spending bill, the Fed more or less has to bankroll it one way or another, whether it's through floating bonds or through financing what the Treasury Department does. So it's a mixed picture.
Is another multi-trillion-dollar spending bill from the U.S. Congress likely at this point, with Republicans running the House, Democrats running the Senate just barely, and the president, I guess, occasionally signing a bill he understands?
Between now and the election, I don't think there will be another one. They could always surprise us, and if they do, look for inflation to go right back up. But I think we're safe for now.
Okay, so we're in better shape for now. Could we also bring down inflation if, say, well, I know one of the requests, demands from the Republicans on the debt ceiling extension was, why don't we tell people who are getting Medicaid or food stamps or TANF welfare, temporary aid to needy families and all that, you got to go out and get at least a part-time job. But that request didn't go anywhere, or did it?
No, and it wouldn't do much for inflation. I think it would be sound policy for the most part, depending on certain hardship cases. But yeah, that would help because if the economy is more productive, that helps to counteract some of the excess money that's going in there. Good monetary policy is a matching game between how much money there is and how much the real economy is putting out. So there are two sides that Congress and the administration can work on.
See, I know nothing about economics, but it does occur to me that if you have more people out working, doing whatever it is, truck driving to get goods where they need to be, or working somewhere and generating a paycheck and maybe on your way to a paycheck that will get you off TANF, food stamps, Section 8, and everything else altogether, then that's good for the long term. But for some reason, the president and the Democrats don't want to do that, and the Republicans don't have the juice to demand it.
No, and same story applies with licenses and regulations and paperwork that prevent normal people from getting good jobs. Those kinds of things could also help.
So what are the moves we ought to be making right now if we really wanted to bring this under control? Because I can't imagine being one of those. I mean, my paycheck hasn't gone up. So, and I'd like it to. I make a nice paycheck, but I understand that. But I'm in a different boat than most people. But when you have a paycheck that goes up 10% and inflation goes up 12%, over time, you actually lost money. You've got less money in your pocket spendable than you did when Biden came into office. And I want to see that fixed for people. And it can't be fixed if their paycheck keeps getting consumed and then some by inflation.
That's exactly right. The short-term fix, the Fed needs to raise interest rates a little bit. Congress, the administration need to cut it out with the excessive spending. The Fed needs to keep money creation in line. But long run, all this was caused by a crisis. Every time there's a crisis, something like this happens. We need rules in place to bind the discretion that agencies and that the Fed and that other actors have during a crisis. The Fed was doing a great job until COVID hit, and then they freaked out and grew the money supply by 40%. If they had a rule in place to stop that from happening in the first place, we never would have had that mess. So I think that's the reform that we need going forward.
That is Ryan Young from the CEI. He's a senior fellow there. I'm glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. I'll get to some of those calls in the next segment. And also, if you want to vote in our Twitter poll, you'll find the question every single day at Lars Larson Show and also on our website at larslarson.com. And you're listening to the Lars Larson Show.